June 1943. A summer night in Texas. The train rolled into Mexia, brakes screeching against the rails. Behind the glass, German prisoners pressed their faces to the windows. What they saw defied everything they had been told. Electric light poured from porches and shop fronts. Strings of bulbs glowed across the main street. Even barns in the distance shimmered under flood lamps. For men raised under Nazi blackout orders, who had lived for years in shadowed cities and shuttered villages, the sight was impossible. A constellation of light, stretching across the plains at 10 o'clock at night. One young sergeant opened his diary, hidden in the folds of his tunic. His pencil scratched against the paper, the words barely legible from the shaking of the carriage. This cannot be true. No nation at war could shine this brightly. He closed the notebook quickly, afraid of being caught. The doors opened. 1,800 veterans of the Afrika Korps stepped onto the platform. Not into cattle cars, not into open wagons, but onto polished ground where the entire town had gathered to watch. Women in cotton dresses, children perched on fences, shopkeepers wiping their hands on aprons to get a better view. Behind the prisoners gleamed Pullman coaches with padded seats and white curtains. Coaches built for comfort, not for captives. An American guard muttered an apology that the air conditioning had failed in one of the cars. The Germans stared. Air conditioning was something they had only heard of in rumors about Hitler's personal train. In that moment, a fracture appeared. The stories drilled into them that America was weak, divided, on the verge of collapse, collided with the glaring evidence of abundance. They had stepped into a land that should not exist, and their unlearning had only just begun. The journey to captivity began at the port of Oran, Algeria. Under the relentless sun, thousands of German prisoners stood in lines that stretched across the docks. They expected chaos, they expected humiliation. What they found instead was order. American officers moved down the rows with clipboards, photographs, and inoculation kits. Identity cards were issued, medical checks completed, injections given. The process ran like a factory floor. Each man logged and processed with precision. To soldiers raised on the myth of German efficiency, it was a jolt. And then came the food. White bread, still soft from the ovens. Coffee, rich and bitter, steaming in tin mugs. Meat, served not as scraps but in portions larger than they had seen in months of desert war. Some prisoners whispered it was a trick, staged to impress them. Others believed they were being fattened for forced labor. Only later would they understand. This was the ordinary ration of the American army. A corporal from the 21st Panzer wrote in his first letter home, "We thought it was propaganda. We did not realize this was normal for them." His words capture the disbelief that rippled through the ranks. Around them loomed the Liberty ships, towering hulls painted black, gangways stretching down to the waterline. To the prisoners, they looked less like transports and more like cities afloat. They learned that one of these ships had been built in just 4 days, a figure so absurd that many laughed outright, convinced it was a lie. Yet soon they would cross the Atlantic aboard these vessels, and the scale of America's production would reveal itself with every discarded loaf, every wasted steak, every light burning through the night. And that voyage would cut even deeper into the heart of Nazi certainty. The Liberty ships pulled away from the Algerian coast, their black hulls cutting across the Atlantic swells. To the German prisoners crowded on deck, the journey itself felt unreal. Only weeks earlier they had fought in the dust of Tunisia. Now they stood aboard vessels that seemed to multiply endlessly on the horizon. Below deck, bunks were crowded but dry. The food, however, became the true shock. Steaming plates of beef, fresh loaves of bread, gallons of milk served in metal pitchers, and with each meal came something more astonishing: the waste. Half-eaten steaks tossed overboard, loaves discarded when they grew stale after a single day, buckets of coffee poured out untouched. One prisoner wrote home years later, "They wasted more in an afternoon than our company received in a week. It was not a performance. The sailors did it casually, with no thought, as if supply had no limit." The ships themselves became floating lessons in American industry. Guards bragged that more than 2,700 Liberty ships had already been built, each from 250,000 parts drawn from across the United States. The prisoners traced the bolts and rivets with their hands, realizing that even this ordinary cargo ship was a monument to coordination beyond anything Germany had achieved. On the bridge, radar dishes turned slowly, sweeping the sea. Many Germans stared in silence. They had been told this technology was rare, a secret of the Reich and the British. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a freighter. As the coastline of Virginia neared, doubts deepened. If this was only the transport stage, what awaited them in the heart of America? The answer would come at Norfolk, a port city glowing brighter than any they had ever seen. August 1943. After 2 weeks at sea, the Liberty ships slid into Norfolk Naval Base. The prisoners crowded the rails, silent, staring. The docks stretched into the horizon, trains swung overhead like steel giants, unloading cargo without pause. Dozens of freighters sat side by side, each spilling mountains of supplies onto the piers. In a single day, this harbour moved more tonnage than Hamburg could manage in a week. One prisoner, a factory worker before the war, counted ship after ship until he lost track. He wrote later, "It was as if the sea itself had become a conveyor belt." Then came the detail that hit even harder: parking lots filled with hundreds of civilian cars. Ordinary dockworkers climbed from their sedans and coupes, lunch pails in hand, heading to shifts. In Germany, automobiles were still a privilege of the elite. The much-promised Volkswagen remained a dream. Here, in a single port town, workers drove their own cars as if it were nothing. The prisoners disembarked under glaring floodlights. Trains waited in long lines, not cattle wagons but polished passenger coaches with dining cars and padded seats. An American guard apologized in German that the air conditioning was out of order in one coach. Some POWs laughed bitterly. For them, such comfort had been reserved only for generals. As the columns marched inland, the sound of factories carried across the night air. Machinery throbbed in the distance, powered by electricity that seemed limitless. One lieutenant whispered, "If this is only one harbour, how vast must the rest of the country be?" The answer would come quickly. Their journey inland, by train through America's small towns and glowing cities, would strip away the last defences of Nazi belief. The trains waited at Norfolk, gleaming in the midday sun. Not the boxcars that had carried German troops across Europe. These were Pullman coaches, polished wood interiors, wide windows, and cushioned seats. Dining cars stood ready with white tablecloths and silver cutlery. For men who had marched through the desert on half rations, it felt unreal. As the wheels clattered westward, disbelief deepened. Out the windows stretched small towns that glowed long after dark. Electric lamps lit every porch. Neon signs pulsed above shop fronts. Even barns along the tracks shone with floodlights. A sergeant whispered to his neighbour, "Every hamlet here has more light than Hamburg." The contrast was crushing. In Germany, blackouts had turned cities into shadows. In America, light poured carelessly into the night sky. POWs pressed their faces to the glass, trying to reconcile what they saw with years of propaganda. At one stop in Virginia, they watched workers resupply the locomotive. Coal poured in from mechanized loaders. Water surged from electric pumps. Tasks that took hours in Germany finished in minutes. The workers themselves struck the prisoners as almost decadent leather boots, cigarettes half-smoked and discarded, Coca-Cola bottles tossed aside. To men raised in scarcity, this casual abundance was more unsettling than open displays of strength. Letters discovered decades later captured the same refrain: "They waste what we longed for. They leave lights burning in empty rooms. They treat food as if it has no value. It is the confidence of infinite supply." For the prisoners, every mile west pulled them deeper into contradiction. If this was ordinary America, what unimaginable power fueled its factories? The answer waited in Tennessee and Kentucky, where the trains would crawl past industrial plants that dwarfed anything in the Reich. By the time the trains crossed into Tennessee, the scenery no longer looked rural. Steel skeletons of factories rose from the horizon, chimneys pumping smoke into the sky. Entire towns seemed to orbit these plants, glowing with the orange of molten furnaces. At Alcoa, a prisoner pressed his face to the glass. He had studied engineering before the war. Now he stared at furnaces consuming more power than the city of Munich. He whispered, almost to himself, "One factory, and it is larger than our entire district." Hours later, the train slowed outside Louisville. Fields that had been empty in 1941 now held 4 sprawling synthetic rubber plants. The Germans had pioneered the process years earlier, but here it had grown into something unrecognizable. Towers, pipelines, distillation columns, and thousands of American workers moving in steady rhythm. Production here already dwarfed Germany's entire annual output. One chemist among the prisoners later recalled the shock. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were not 4 in the country, there were dozens. Then came Detroit. From miles away, the POWs could see the Willow Run plant stretching like a city unto itself. Inside, 42,000 workers assembled bombers piece by piece. A B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every hour. Through the train windows, prisoners counted the aircraft, wings spread and gleaming under floodlights. They had been told American planes were crude, hastily built, yet the precision of the lines told another story. This was not improvisation, this was mastery. The deeper the trains moved into America, the more the prisoners realized. Germany had brought rifles to fight against assembly lines. Ahead lay an even harsher truth: America's food empire, vast enough to feed armies and still waste more than Germany could ever imagine. The train crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, wheels rumbling across the great steel bridge. Below them, barges loaded with wheat stretched along the river banks. To the prisoners, it looked less like a river and more like an endless conveyor belt of grain. One Bavarian farmer whispered, "This single barge could feed my entire village for years." On the far shore, silos rose like towers. Each held more wheat than Germany imported in a season, and still, the line of elevators continued beyond sight. To men raised on ration cards, it was a vision of impossible plenty. Kansas brought another shock. The train slowed near stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle bellowed. The air was heavy with the smell of meat-packing plants. American workers unwrapped sandwiches piled thick with beef. A corporal muttered, "They eat meat the way we eat bread." At one station, a guard casually bought hamburgers for the POW escort detail. He returned with a bag heavy enough to feed 20 men, paid for with a single crumpled dollar bill. The prisoners stared at the sandwiches. Cheese, vegetables, meat layered on soft white bread. To them, it was not just food, it was proof. Proof that America could afford to treat abundance as ordinary. Later that night, as the train rolled past farmland glowing under electric lamps, a prisoner wrote in his diary, "They transport food as we transport ammunition. They destroy distance with grain and cattle, the way we tried with tanks and guns." The men leaned against the glass in silence. If food alone was so vast, what would the camps themselves reveal? The answer waited in Texas barbed wire cities where even captivity would feel more comfortable than freedom in the Reich. By late summer 1943, the trains reached Texas. Beyond the fences of Camp Hearn rose rows of fresh barracks, wood still smelling of sawdust. Barbed wire encircled the compound. But inside, the prisoners found something they had not expected: comfort. Each building held electric lights, flush toilets, and hot showers. Radiators stood ready for winter. For men accustomed to cold water basins and coal stoves back home, these facilities felt closer to luxury than captivity. The hospital astonished them most. German surgeons walked into wards equipped with X-ray machines, sterilizers, and cabinets filled with medicine. On the shelves sat penicillin, the drug they had heard rumors of but never touched. In Germany, even sulfur tablets were scarce. Here, the Americans used their newest medicine freely, even on minor wounds. The kitchens shocked them further. Walk-in refrigerators hummed, gas ranges flared to life, electric mixers churned dough by the barrel. The menu included fresh milk, eggs, vegetables, and meat in quantities unimaginable across the Reich since 1939. A prisoner who had once worked as a hotel chef wrote, "We discarded more food in 1 week than my family had seen in 3 years. Even recreation revealed abundance, a library with shelves of English and German books, a theatre with projectors for American films, sports fields lined with chalk. For many, it was the first time they had seen baseball. Of course, barbed wire remained, towers loomed, Guards watched, but the contrast was undeniable. Prisoners who expected hardship found themselves living better than German civilians under Nazi rule, and soon, captivity would carry them even further out of the camps and into the American heartland, where work in farms and factories exposed them to prosperity on a national scale. By autumn 1943, America faced a labor shortage. With millions of young men overseas, fields and factories needed hands. The solution was controversial, but practical. German prisoners would work. Trucks rolled out of the camps each morning, guarded but unblindfolded. POWs looked out the windows as Texas farmland stretched to the horizon. What they saw unsettled them more than barbed wire ever had. At a cotton gin outside Houston, one machine processed in an hour what entire villages in Germany handled in weeks. A Bavarian farmer wrote later, "The man who owned it was no aristocrat, just a farmer, yet he had electricity, running water, tractors, and 2 cars." In Nebraska, POWs watched harvesters roll across endless beet fields, machines cutting and loading at a pace 100 men could not match. Even the farmer's teenage son drove a tractor worth more than most German households. When the prisoner commented, the boy only laughed and said a newer model was on order. Factories told the same story. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, rows of conveyor belts filled and sealed cans with the rhythm of a machine heartbeat. Elderly women oversaw entire sections, monitoring dials while sipping coffee. A German food plant worker muttered, "In Hamburg, 50 men would have been needed for this line." Every shift reinforced the same lesson. America produced not through slogans or sacrifice, but through machines, power, and people who seemed ordinary yet commanded extraordinary resources. For many POWs, the shock cut deeper than military defeat. Germany's promise of superiority crumbled in front of humming engines and overflowing silos, and outside the fences, a new question began to rise. Were the prisoners being treated too kindly? That debate would spark the next chapter. Back home, rumors spread. American newspapers ran editorials claiming the government coddled German prisoners. Why should men who had fought for Hitler eat steak while civilians at home stretched ration stamps? 2. The image of comfort inside the camps stirred anger. Baseball fields, libraries, even Christmas packages to many. It looked like indulgence. But behind the fences, the story was more complex. Geneva Convention rules required proper housing, food, and medical care. Washington knew that mistreating Germans would endanger American POWs held in Europe. Every hot meal and clean shower in Texas was insurance for the safety of American boys in German camps. Inspections were constant. Red Cross officials walked the barracks, checked kitchens, and interviewed prisoners. Their reports confirmed compliance, but also noted discipline, curfews, roll calls, punishments for infractions. The comfort was real, but so was the structure, and the generosity carried strategy. Every discarded loaf, every baseball game played under floodlights, every lecture on democracy was meant to show a contrast, not propaganda forced onto prisoners, but reality observed day after day. Guards understood that abundance itself was a weapon. One American officer put it bluntly, "We don't need to break them, we just need to let them see." For the Germans inside the wire, it worked. Comfort was never mistaken for weakness. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting everything they lacked at home and everything their leaders had promised but failed to deliver. Outside the camps, suspicion lingered. Inside, belief in Nazi superiority was already eroding, and soon that erosion would accelerate not in lecture halls or barracks, but in simple human encounters when enemies sat down with Americans and discovered unexpected common ground. Beyond the fences, the war felt far away. In the campyard, music drifted from an accordion. A German POW played familiar folk tunes and then almost shyly switched to an American melody he had picked up from a guard. Soon the guards joined in, humming along, the distance between enemies narrowing for a moment. On nearby farms, encounters cut even deeper. A farmer's wife showed prisoners how to cook cornbread in a cast-iron skillet, laughing at their surprise when it rose golden and fluffy. For men raised on black bread and ration coupons, the dish felt almost like cake. They ate with gratitude, and she treated them not as captives, but as hired hands who had worked hard in her fields. Then there was the unspoken irony. African American soldiers guarded camps where German prisoners sometimes lived with more comfort than black servicemen themselves. Black newspapers noted the injustice, yet many guards carried out their duties with professionalism. A few even remarked quietly to the POWs, "You're lucky you're not on our side of the line." That contradiction left lasting impressions on both groups, exposing cracks in the myth of American perfection. Children, too, became unexpected teachers. At one small-town church picnic, a group of local boys traded marbles with POWs, pointing and laughing despite the language gap. A prisoner later wrote, "The boys treated us as if we were simply men, not enemies." Their innocence broke through everything our officers had told us. These moments of ordinary kindness, a song, a meal, a child's laughter, struck harder than speeches or statistics. They revealed a society confident enough to humanize its foes. And as winter approached, that spirit of generosity would shine brightest during a holiday that Germans thought they knew by heart. December 1943. The harshness of captivity softened for a brief moment. In camp kitchens, soldiers peeled potatoes and baked pies. In the barracks, makeshift Christmas trees stood next to wooden bunks. The smell of cinnamon and roasting turkey began to fill the air. The prisoners had never known such generosity from an enemy. Thousands of Christmas packages arrived from the American Red Cross. Inside, there were cigarettes, candies, socks, even games. One prisoner, a former hotel bellboy, wrote in his diary, "The food, the treats, the unexpected kindness, it felt more like a holiday than a punishment." But it wasn't just the gifts, it was the way Americans treated their former enemies. A local Methodist choir came to perform Christmas carols in German. Women from the town baked cookies and cakes, sending them to the camps for prisoners. Some even invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though most were too far away to attend. At Camp Herne, men who had spent years in the harshest conditions now found themselves sitting at tables filled with ham, turkey, mashed potatoes, pies, and ice cream. For prisoners who had subsisted on scraps and rations, the abundance was nearly incomprehensible. A soldier from the Luftwaffe, whose family had suffered from bombings in Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies, they know what we have done, and yet they treat us with kindness, not hatred." The warmth of this generosity shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda. The men who once believed they were the superior race now saw the true strength of their enemy. Mercy, compassion, and confidence in victory. And as the camp lights flickered out that Christmas Eve, the prisoners quietly realized their captors had already won the war not through force, but through humanity. By the spring of 1944, the transformation was undeniable. Prisoners who had arrived as Nazi soldiers now sat in classrooms, writing essays, discussing democracy, and reading books they had once been told were dangerous. In the barracks, makeshift schoolrooms filled with German soldiers trying to grasp English. American teachers, including many Jewish refugees, taught them about the Constitution, civil rights, and the history of democracy. Some POWs found the lessons overwhelming. Others were eager to learn, devouring every page of the books provided. At Camp Shelby, one of the largest camps, professors from the University of Chicago sent courses on economics and American government. The prisoners, many of whom had been elite officers and engineers back home now, found themselves struggling to understand the very ideals they had spent years denouncing. One former German officer wrote home, "We are learning more about the United States in a few months than we ever did in school. Their system, their ideas, it is like looking into a new world." The camp libraries, once filled with military manuals and Nazi propaganda, were now stocked with novels, history books, and even plays by Shakespeare. Some prisoners became fascinated with American literature, writing about the works of Mark Twain and the philosophies of Thomas Jefferson. One man, a former member of the SS, stood before his fellow prisoners and said, "We are not just prisoners of war. We are students. The enemy is teaching us how to think, not how to fight." The re-education programs spread across camps, and the thirst for knowledge grew. What began as a way to occupy time became a profound shift in perspective. But this intellectual awakening didn't stop at democracy. The next phase would challenge their very understanding of what it meant to be human. June 6, 1944. The prisoners awoke to a new kind of silence. The sound of the camp's morning roll call seemed distant, muted. A rumor had spread the Allies were landing in Normandy. At first, many didn't believe it. After all, they had been told the invasion would never come, that Germany's defences were unbreakable. Yet, as the day wore on, the news began to trickle in, first from American soldiers, then from a secret broadcast. Prisoners gathered around, eyes wide. The invasion was real. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 soldiers had hit the beaches of France. The scale of the operation was beyond comprehension. One prisoner, a veteran of the Eastern Front, said quietly, "We thought the Soviet Union was our greatest threat, but this is something else entirely." For many, the shock was immediate. They had been told for years that the Allies were disorganized, weak, incapable of mass coordination. But now, the very country they had ridiculed had orchestrated an operation of staggering complexity. As the news spread, the prisoners felt something shift. What they had once believed was the natural order. Germany's superiority now seemed like a fragile myth, crushed under the weight of reality. In the days that followed, as Allied forces poured into Europe, the last illusions held by the prisoners began to fall apart. They had seen America's strength in factories, farms, and classrooms, but now they witnessed it on the battlefield. And as they watched the footage of the invasion's success, many of them realized the war was already lost for Germany. But it wasn't just the war. The entire Nazi ideology they had fought for was crumbling before their eyes. As 1944 wore on, the psychological shift among the prisoners became impossible to ignore. The ideological collapse that began with food, light, and industry now deepened with something far more personal: humanity. For the first time, the prisoners began to see Americans not just as enemies, but as human beings, people who treated them with dignity, even while fighting a brutal war. It wasn't just the Christmas gifts or the songs sung in German. It was the way American guards interacted with them, in small, ordinary moments. One prisoner, a former soldier, recalled a guard approaching him during a work detail. The guard handed him a pack of cigarettes and said, "I know you're hungry. We'll get you some food after you're done here." It was a simple act, yet for a man who had been raised to believe that Americans were weak and greedy, it was nothing short of revolutionary. In the hospitals, where German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, there was no cruelty, only care. Prisoners received treatment for diseases and injuries they would have been left to suffer from in Germany. They were treated like men, not animals. One former officer, whose family had been torn apart by Allied bombings, remarked, "They could have ignored our wounds, but they didn't. They treated us as people." What had started as a strategic mission, showing the prisoners the power of American industry and prosperity, had shifted. Now, it was the simple, undeniable evidence of kindness that was doing the real work. But the final blow to Nazi ideology would come not from factories, not from food, but from a word that had once been the enemy of everything the prisoners believed: forgiveness. Christmas 1944 brought the final, most profound revelation. For months, the prisoners had been exposed to America's industrial might, its abundance, and its humanity. But now, they were about to experience something that would shatter their Nazi beliefs once and for all: forgiveness. The Red Cross had sent thousands of packages to the camps, but there was more. In each camp, local American churches and civic groups sent holiday gifts, treats, toiletries, even toys for the soldiers. But it wasn't just the material gifts, it was the gesture itself. In one camp, a group of local women came to perform a Christmas concert, singing traditional carols in German. At Camp Herne, a Methodist choir sang Silent Night, the very carol that had once been a symbol of unity in Germany during wartime. For the first time, German POWs sang it not as enemies, but as men struggling to understand a kindness they had never known. The most extraordinary moment came when local families, including those who had lost sons in the war, invited prisoners to Christmas dinners. Though regulations prevented most from attending, the gesture itself spoke volumes. The families knew these men were their enemies, yet they offered them a seat at the table. One prisoner, a former Nazi party member, later wrote, "We had been told that Americans were weak, divided, and decadent. Yet here, They showed us kindness that had never been shown to us by our own people. For many prisoners, this was the moment when their faith in Nazi ideals began to completely unravel. They realized that their enemies, the Americans, were capable of something that they had been taught to despise: compassion. And in this compassion, the last traces of their Nazi allegiance began to fade. By the winter of 1944, the American camps were no longer just places of captivity. For many of the German prisoners, they had become unexpected schools institutions of a sort, where the lessons weren't just about agriculture or machinery, but about the very foundations of democracy. One former officer, who had arrived in 1943, believing in Germany's superiority, sat in a camp classroom and wrote, "We are learning to think in ways we never thought possible." These lessons were not forced upon them, they were offered freely. As the prisoners learned about American history, they were given the opportunity to compare it with their own past. The education programs were expansive. Some prisoners took correspondence courses through the University of Chicago, studying everything from English to economics. Others gathered in small groups, discussing democracy, civil rights, and the future of post-war Germany. In the kitchens, the camps taught more than just cooking. Prisoners learned to appreciate the difference between rationed, mass-produced meals and the fresh, plentiful food that American soldiers and civilians ate daily. For the first time in years, German prisoners were given the tools to rebuild not just their country, but themselves. They were offered lessons not only in skills, but in the values that would guide their future: freedom, democracy, and equality. As they prepared for repatriation, many prisoners reflected on the stark contrast between the world they had known before the war and the world they were about to return to. It was a world of rubble, devastation, and division. But they had seen something else, something that would stay with them forever. By the spring of 1945, the war was drawing to a close. As the first wave of German prisoners boarded the trains for repatriation, the mood in the camps was a mix of uncertainty and quiet reflection. The men who had once stood proud in their uniforms now wore plain civilian clothes, their minds heavy with everything they had learned and everything they had lost. The journey back to Germany was long and silent. The once pristine uniforms were now stained and frayed. For many, it felt like returning to a past that was no longer theirs to claim. Yet the transformation they had undergone was undeniable. They had seen a world beyond the walls of their ideology, a world where people were not defined by race, but by the values they upheld. One former officer, whose diary had once been filled with fervent belief in Nazi superiority, now wrote, "I am returning to a broken Germany, but I am carrying with me something new, something I never imagined I would believe in." When they arrived back in the ruins of their homeland, the contrast was stark. The cities lay in rubble, the infrastructure shattered, and the people were weary, struggling to rebuild after years of war. But for the returning prisoners, the most profound change was internal. They had witnessed what America had accomplished in just a few years. They had seen the strength of democracy, the prosperity of a free society, and they knew, deep down, that rebuilding Germany meant more than just restoring factories and fields. It meant adopting the very ideals they had once rejected. As they began to reintegrate into their shattered society, they carried the seeds of a new Germany, one rooted not in conquest but in creation. By 1950, West Germany was emerging from the rubble. A new generation of leaders, shaped not by war, but by their experiences as prisoners of war, would soon play a crucial role in the country's recovery. Among them were men who had spent years in American camps, learning more than just English or farming techniques. They had learned the true power of democracy, the potential of a free market, and the strength of social cooperation. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, would become the West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Holstein, who had studied economics and democracy while in captivity, would later become the first president of the European Commission. These men, once part of a war machine, now built bridges between nations. In the factories and fields, former POWs-turned-workers applied the lessons they had learned. They understood industrial efficiency not from theory, but from real, lived experience. They had seen how America's factories could produce at an unimaginable scale. They knew what it meant to work in a system that valued creativity, innovation, and efficiency. This knowledge would help transform the German economy. The factories of the post-war years were built on the foundations of what these men had seen in the camps, a new vision of work, where prosperity was not gained through conquest, but through collaboration and ingenuity. But their transformation wasn't just economic, it was ideological. They had witnessed a society that believed in the potential of all its people, a society where differences didn't lead to division, but to strength. As Germany rebuilt, the impact of those years in American captivity became undeniable. They had been broken by defeat, but emerged with a vision that would shape the future of Europe. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, over 500 former German POWs gathered in Austin, Texas. They came not as former enemies, but as men who had seen the future and helped shape it. Many had returned to the United States over the years, reconnecting with the families who had sent them Christmas cards or shared their dinner tables. Some had even brought their children, showing them the places where their transformation began. At the reunion dinner, the former POWs stood to deliver a message of gratitude, reflecting on the remarkable journey they had taken from prisoners to partners. Hans Kroll, the former diplomat, spoke for them all. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth." The reunion was more than a reflection on the past. It was a testament to the power of transformation, of how the most hardened beliefs can be undone not through force, but through exposure to a different way of life, a way that values freedom, equality, and cooperation. As they raised their glasses, the men who had once marched across Europe as part of a war machine now stood as ambassadors of peace, bridging the gap between nations that had once been torn apart. Their transformation was a story of redemption, not just for them, but for a Europe rebuilding from the ashes. The seeds planted in American prison camps had blossomed into the foundations of the European Union and beyond, reshaping the continent forever. The lessons they learned on American soil helped build not only a new Germany, but a new Europe. The war was long over, but the echoes of its lessons would resonate through generations.